This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for an important conversation. As a part of our series commemorating and thinking through 45 years of emergency. 45 years ago, in 1975, the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency just before midnight on 25th June 1975, claiming the existence of a threat to internal security of the nation. The declaration suspended the constitutional rights of free speech and assembly and imposed censorship of press, and limited the powers of the judiciary to review the executive action, and ordered the arrest of opposition leaders. Before dawn broke, the police swooped down on government opponents. Among those arrested was 72-year-old Gandhian socialist Jayaprakash Narayan. In the last 45 years, on the eve of the thinking about the emergency, newspapers often publish reports talking about the series of disruptions that happened, but often placing the emergency within the context of an aberration, but not as a part of a long constitutional history in which the Indian constitution is being dismantled. Joining us today to think through this period is V. Krishnan Ananth, who teaches at the Department of History at Sikkim University. He did his PhD from the Center for Historical Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. He joined The Hindu in 1991 and reported on the national politics for 13 years, and he's written extensively for various newspapers. Dr. Ananth has also authored books, India Since Independence, Making Sense of Indian Politics, Politics of Times Churning, the Arasiyal Suvadugal, and Emergency Nadandadu Enna, and contributed articles in edited volumes, journals, and newspapers. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi.
One of the things that is constantly spoken about the emergency, especially for those of us who were born much after the emergency and then the generation following us, is that the emergency is some kind of a ghost, an aberration. I was wondering if you could start with laying out what the emergency was, how it happened, perhaps also the prehistory of the emergency.
Yeah, I think talking about the emergency, and we need to continuously talk about the emergency, interrogate what happened during the emergency, if not for anything else, in order to understand that India as a nation was presumed on a certain framework of constitutional democracy, and that presumption has to be reified again and again, and we need to keep interrogating as to what happened to that constitutional scheme over the period. And 45 years after the event is pretty much a time that we need to talk about it. Now, when we talk about what happened on the night of, let's say, 25th of June 1975, when Indira Gandhi actually I would always say that, annulled the constitution or suspended the constitution. And to do that, she made use of a provision in the constitution, that is Article 352. So in some sense, it was some kind of a constitutional onslaught on the constitution itself. Having said that, I would want to locate the emergency in three contexts. One is the long-term context, and that was the kind of slide that the Indian National Congress as a political party, not just as an organization, which it was prior to independence, but as a political party, it began to slide in terms of its influence over the Indian people, and it began in 1967, or rather it was manifest in 1967, exactly about 10 years before the emergency was finally lifted. So when the Congress lost power in almost 9 states, and then Uttar Pradesh also joined that, when Charan Singh actually left the Congress to go to form a government, there was a first rupture in terms of what the constitution was. And Indira Gandhi did seek to reinvent the Congress, particularly with the constitution amendments, which led to, let's say, further land reforms, and all of it is credited to P.N. Huxer. Huxer was Indira Gandhi's advisor, and it was Huxer who is credited to have told her that, let's get back to the idea of socialism. But this notwithstanding, there were certain what I call the medium term or the interim kind of a crisis that began to unfold beginning 1971, and that was in fact the factors, or rather the agents that triggered this crisis, were beyond the control of the regime in India. One was the developments in East Pakistan, subsequently leading to the liberation of Bangladesh. And mind you, I think, any kind of a victory has 1,000 fathers, and Indira Gandhi's victory then sort of, even led to the lead, personality from the opposition, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, lauding her as Ma Durga. But having said that, the strain of the kind of the battle, the war, the Indo-Pak war that led to liberation of Bangladesh, did have its repercussions in terms of government finances, public finances, which again led to, in fact, it's very important now that we talk about the DA freeze that has been announced recently. In 1973, when prices were actually increasing threefold, there was an inflation of roughly about 30% kind of a thing in the 3 years, and the DA was actually impounded. It was not even frozen, it was impounded. A DA installment was impounded. And this, along with the price rise, led to kind of a rise in the cost of living, manifesting, let's say, the protests in Ahmedabad, particularly in an engineering college, over high mess fee, hike in mess fees, and so on and so forth. And one. Number two, and there was another factor that led to this crisis, and that was something that happened in the Persian Gulf, that is the OPEC, the oil producing and exporting countries, deciding to sort of, form a cartel and thus dictate prices rather than letting, quote unquote, the market to determine and loot them. So these two actually had a huge implication on the government finances. And the third important factor was, once again, when Indira Gandhi actually arrives, and she now has, after the Congress split, she has the Congress organization as her own private preserve, and there what I call the command mode, or the high command mode, the beginning of it, led to her handpicking chief ministers in the various states that where the Congress again returned to power in 1972 after the Bangladesh liberation. Now, among them, a large number of them were sort of, accused of corruption. For example, the then chief minister of Gujarat, Chimanbhai Patel, the popular slogan that actually sort of echoed in the streets of Gujarat was Chiman Chor, Gadi Chor. That, so in some sense, there was a crisis of confidence, a crisis of legitimacy that Indira Gandhi was caught. And this again led to a kind of rallying of the opposition parties. And for once, the opposition parties could legitimate themselves because they were rallying behind Jayaprakash Narayan, the Gandhian socialist, who had a halo around himself that, he was not there for any kind of an office of profit. So it was in this particular context that you had the Allahabad High Court judgment unseating Indira Gandhi for corrupt electoral practices. In fact, in hindsight, we can say that, it was punishing, let's say, a very high constitutional official for a minor traffic offense. Now, having said that, the law was law, and the Allahabad High Court unseating Indira Gandhi, then the interim stay that Justice Krishna Iyer in the Supreme Court gave. In fact, it was very important. Justice Krishna Iyer refused to stay the operation of the Allahabad High Court judgment. On the contrary, he only sort of, added a clause that the Constitution, however, provides somebody can continue as Prime Minister for 6 months until he is elected. So this large context actually was important. You had a crisis of legitimacy, and yet, I would want to say that unlike what it is today, in 1975, there was a crisis, let's say, in terms of money, in terms of inflation, so on and so forth. And yet, I would want to insist today, with hindsight, and particularly when we are trying to compare today, that it wasn't a systemic crisis that what we witnessed today in terms of the economic problems. The 73, 74 were actually sort of, caused by factors, developments that happened somewhere in the world, including some of these developments in India, and corruption was beginning to show its face. It wasn't a hugely systemic crisis. There wasn't a crisis of capitalism or world capitalism or neoliberal economy that, as that we are facing today. And there was a large opposition that was there gathering on the streets, resisting Indira Gandhi and questioning her legitimacy to remain in power. So in that sense, I think when we talk about the emergency today and from today's context, we need to keep this in mind, that what happened on the 25th of June 1975 was perhaps a reaction to a small problem, but not a reaction to some kind of a structural systemic crisis that we are actually witnessing today.
And that kind of brings us to multiple threads. But what I really want to now focus on specifically is this idea of the constitution. Again, as I started off saying, that often the emergency it's placed within the context of an aberration. But many commentators, including yourself, have spoken about how this is not so much of an aberration, but now we really need to think of it within the long durée. And now comparing this very particular moment, one feels that India as a constitutional democracy is already being dismantled. How would you compare this moment with emergency? It's also somebody else also recently said that Indira Gandhi could have never imagined the kind of power that, say, what Mr. Prime Minister Narendra Modi now possesses.
Well, I think, I mean, we are talking about two different times and, two very distinct phases in India's politics. When we're talking about the 70s, they're still sort of, let's actually sort of, put in place another very important event that happened in the 1970s, and just before the emergency was declared, perhaps the May 1974 railway strike. And today we are talking in the month of May. Several years in 1974, the railway workers across the country, beginning the 2nd of May, they stopped working. So there was, and perhaps the largest ever organized working class protest in India, in independent India, until then and even subsequently. So, I mean, I think, what is very important for us is the retreat of, let's say, democratic politics. I mean, when we're talking about democratic politics, we are not just talking about sort of, a certain kind of a framework within parliament, but democracy essentially is politics practiced on the streets where the and this is something, and when we're talking about the constitution, let's not forget Article 38 of the constitution, that is the directive principles, had actually laid the foundations, and it was actually from the directive principles of state policy, and particularly Article 38, that we have the words in the preamble that we the people of India give to ourselves this constitution in order to ensure justice, social, economic and political, and that sequence is very important. And all these are actually sort of, if you read Article 38 of the Constitution, it very clearly emanates from that, the preamble emanates. So in some sense, when we talk about envisioned, when the founding fathers of the Constitution envisioned what we call the idea of India, which is very, very important, it also envisioned a democratic polity, not just in terms of sort of, and if you look at the manner in which fundamental rights were structured, these were negative injunctions against the state. That the state shall not do anything to infringe upon the rights of the people. So in some sense, the people were at the center of this constitutional scheme that we are talking about. And the 1970s perhaps was one very important kind of a phase. What I would call was, it was probably the most important ruptural movement when, there was this constitutional idea of India was put to test. And today we are able to talk about it because, while the 42nd Amendment, which again was something that completely destroyed the Constitution or the spirit of the Constitution, the fact is that, India bounced back. And the most important part of it was in a democratic election, the same Indira Gandhi, she was defeated in her own constituency. And that gave a lot of hope to this what we call the idea of India, that the people always will determine what should happen.
But
now, when we are talking about the present, yeah, please.
I kind of wanted to jump in, but do you now feel that, as an Indian today, I was born almost a decade after the emergency. I was there in India during the CAA protests, seeing young activists and scholars being arrested, seeing people like Dr. Anand Teltumre, writers and activists like Gautam Navlakha, Sudha Bharadwaj, and many others being arrested, and the constitutional courts standing almost as the clergy of the state. I wonder, I seriously have questions whether the Indian people actually feel that their constitution is theirs. I feel very alienated from my constitution right now. So I was wondering, how do you place this moment? I'm sure there was also a moment of great sadness and sorrow and even disillusionment during the emergency.
Well, I think, I recall the ADM Jabalpur and versus Shivkan Shukla moment that has, even quite recently that, I said somewhere that Justice H.R. Khanna remains the tallest in terms of, India's judicial history. And I'm really sad that, there isn't a moment that, it's been. But having said that, I think, let's look at it this way. The same set of people who actually were sort of, okay, let me use this word because, his own son called it wrong, Justice Y.V. Chandrachud. One of those who was guilty in the ADM Jabalpur versus Shivkan Shukla moment. Ended up actually a decade later. That is the decade that the post Bhopal decade that I would say that there was this hope of democratic politics once again, sort of getting that new shape. Particularly when people began to address issues that were central to the constitutional scheme. Let me look at it like let's say Olga Telles, a journalist, and Praful Bidwai. Together, actually, they brought to the fore the case of the slum dwellers, the pavement dwellers in Bombay. And the Supreme Court and Justice Chandrachud again sort of took the lead in setting a new jurisprudence on what is Article 21 and what right to life is all about in the constitutional scheme. Neerja Chowdhury, a journalist, actually went about talking about what is happening with the bonded labor across Madhya Pradesh, and the Supreme Court takes a suo motu notice of it, gets public interest litigation. So in fact, the emergency and the experience of the emergency did sort of, take us to a stage where I think the 1980s, the media was trailblazing to sort of, rework democracy, or sort of further deepen democracy. The judiciary was sort of, playing a very proactive role once again in deepening democracy. Corruption scandals were brought about, I think, beginning with what Arun Shourie did with the oil scam, in which, incidentally, Kamal Nath, who until recently was the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh, was implicated, until the Bofors scandal. So in some sense, the 80s witnessed. And what I find as some kind of a breaking point into what we can call the slide into unfreedom would be the moments of 1989-90. And let me sort of, put on the table the three most important moments that I think are responsible for this kind of regression that we are probably sort of witnessing. One was, of course, the collapse of the idea of a kind of a socialist alternative, beginning with what happened in Soviet Union and the rest of Eastern Europe. Once again, sort of it had its beginnings in the 70s, Soviet Union's occupation or sort of involvement in Afghanistan, and the whole idea of sort of individual freedom, which took a beating during the Stalinist era and all those things. So that was one decisive moment, I think, that influenced what happened subsequently and, what we have actually been led to. The second and the most important moment, I would think, was a kind of consensus among the articulate sections of the middle classes. And when I make this point, I want to sort of make this point very important, because the articulate sections of the middle classes were in fact in the forefront in terms of leading the struggle for independence, in terms of sort of whatever little resistance to the emergency and almost every such political or economic movement. And the articulate sections of the middle classes suddenly found themselves being threatened into exclusion by one very important development in India's politics, and that was the Mandal movement. So, in some sense, if a large section that looked at democracy as merely a political right, and that is something that went wrong with us, looked at democracy as merely a political right and having nothing to do with, let's say, economic rights, social justice, and so on and so forth, which unfortunately constituted our middle classes, our intelligentsia. Thanks to I would say, that's perhaps where the Nehruvian idea of constitutional India was weakest in terms of social justice. And the Mandal movement actually sort of, took the articulate sections to a third pen. And the third important moment there was what we call the neoliberal, or what we call sort of, market, something that, Thomas Friedman had called the world is flat, or Fukuyama called the end of history, and all such crap, I would say. Because, I say that, like, they were not sustainable for the simple reason that neoliberal capitalism has come to a point of, a very, very irretrievable kind of a crisis beginning 2006-07. Now, it is the combination of these three, I suppose, led to what I will call the retreat of political freedom, economic freedom, and social freedom. And that is where I think, I'd see. And the kind of forces that were reacting to it. So, falling out from all these things, we found in India, and particularly the 1980s, the post-Bhopal gas tragedy, witnessed a kind of what I would call the new social movements, which were definitely sort of, talking about it, while established political parties, all those who, even those who actually sort of, threw up a lot of hope beginning the 60s, the socialist movement and all, began taking the shape of sort of, part of the establishment. So there was this kind of a consensus that we witnessed during the 90s, when you have resistance which is segmented. You have an environmentalist group which is sort of, talking about Bhopal, organizing the people, and, you have an anti-dam movement, and there was this kind of fragmentation, let's say, of the resistance, unlike in the 1970s when the fragmented opposition parties came together against Indira Gandhi. What we witnessed in the 80s is the beginning of a fragmentation of any kind of popular resistance, of any kind of a democratic sentiment. And this perhaps is what I think, caused what we can call the progressive erosion of constitutional democracy and values. And the most pronounced of this happens to be in the media. So